thank you all for being here tonight for what has become a series that we're doing with the Truman Library, the Truman Presidential Library, and the Truman Library Institute on the winners of the every 2 years Truman Book Award. And I'll get into that in a second, and into our introduction of Professor Allan Millett, one of our greatest, if not our greatest, military historian, and a presentation of the award. I want to particularly thank Mike Devine, the director of the Truman Presidential Library. I want to thank Alex Burden, who is the president of the Truman Library Institute, and Mary Hunkler, the chairman of the board of the Truman Library Institute, who is here tonight as well, for not only the support of this program, the Held to the Chiefs program, the program tonight with Allan Millett, the Truman Book Award programs, but really for making the Truman Presidential Library the premier presidential library in the United States, premier educational programs. We've worked with the Kauffman Foundation jointly to highlight what the Truman Library does in this part of town and for Kansas City as a whole. Not everybody gets out to Independence all the time, and that's a mistake, because the library itself is a spectacular place. The exhibits about Truman's life and times, the exhibit about the presidency, which remains the defining presidency of the modern era. What we are living through today in the Middle East and in Asia and in Europe is the legacy of decisions that Harry Truman and his administration made. And the Truman Library is a tremendous educational institution around those decisions and American history. So I want to thank the Truman Library for doing this. I also want to thank the Kauffman Foundation for their joint sponsorship of these activities. Great, thank you. The Truman Book Award is given out by the Truman Scholarship Committee, and our little the subcommittee of that committee includes some people who have become good friends of mine, some of them just by email and phone, but some great historians. Michelle Mart, I think is at the University of Pittsburgh, Bill Miscamble, who is one of the leading Cold War historians, and Lon Hamby, who many of you, those of you who are Truman affiliacs, will know Lon Hamby because he produced one of the great biographies of Harry Truman, and is also a great author on New Deal subjects. And we constituted the Truman Book Award committee this year, and it actually wasn't a very difficult. I'm trying to convince Allan Millett that I'm responsible for this award. And without my fighting really hard for it, he wouldn't have gotten this award, because if I ever publish, a book, I'm hoping he'll blurb it after I've told him that I got him this award. But the truth is, his book stood head and shoulders above the other books that were available. So we read 28 books in a relatively short period of time. I want to thank Lisa Sullivan of the Truman Library, who gave us those books, who poured them down our throats. Lisa, thank you for her good work on this. But we read 28 books, and head and shoulders above the other books was Allan Millett's book. It is the second book in his War for Korea series of trilogy, of which two have appeared now, and which has already become the defining work on the Korean War. And tonight in our audience, and I'd like you to celebrate them for a minute. We have a number of Korean War veterans. In fact, would those of you who are here tonight who are Korean War veterans stand up and let us recognize you? Thank you very much for your service, and in particular, the Korean War has been a little bit of a forgotten war. We've done a number of programs at the library about the Korean War, trying to reverse that that issue in America's historical memory, but it certainly was a defining moment. For Harry Truman as president. It was a defining moment for the United States in deciding to draw a line in the Cold War, and it remains a defining moment in the history of Asia. As we know from the constant concern we have with North Korea, and the constant difficulties, and what will become the increased significance of our relationship with China. Allan Millett has written about Korea, but he's also written about the United States military history in many other forms. He's written what is the essential book on the history of the U.S. Marine Corps, Semper Fidelis. He's written the Common Defense, for a Common Defense, which is perhaps the best complete military history of the United States as a whole, as well as a co-author of perhaps the best one-volume book on World War II. I'm personally a fan of a book that he edited and contributed to, Calculations, which is a look at World War II from the point of view of the correlation of forces and what each individual country, I think there's 7 countries that book looks at, and how they looked at their own forces versus the forces around them. And it's really a book about how we decide to go to war and why we decide to go to war. It's, I think, a really important book. He has been called the most important military historian we have. He had a long career at Ohio State, at the Mershon Center, and as a professor at Ohio State. It's said that he produced more PhDs at Ohio State than any other professor. He's now a professor, the Ambrose professor, that would be Stephen Ambrose, at the University of New Orleans, and the advisor to the president of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It is a real honor to present Allan Millett to you, and Professor Millett, if you will come up, Alex Burden and I of the Truman Library would like to present you with the Truman Book Award for 2012. We have one more presentation to make, which is a check. And we're told that UMB Bank will be happy to cash this particular check.
It looked like it was written by Jesse James.
We don't like bank robbers. That's
Thank you, Bill.
Allan Millett.
I've been very fortunate to do a great deal of traveling, and Kansas City, in fact, is not unknown to me. I started my academic career in 1966 as a professor at a nice little university down the road about 120 miles called Mizzou. And I think I still remember the first line of the fight song. Fighting Tigers we will always be. That's close enough, I guess. But Kansas City, of course, was a great hub of scholarly activity, at least certainly for military historians, at the Truman Library, the Eisenhower Library, University Press of Kansas, which I'm very fond of because they publish my books. There's Fort Leavenworth and Fort Riley, reasonably close by. Even as a Marine Corps Reserve officer, I got to know Overland Park, largely because that's where they messed up all our administrative work. Not really. This journey has included a number of people, and I want to recognize, first of all, my wife, Martha, who has been my inspiration and greatest positive critic for many, many years, and certainly has shared our Korean experience. Also like to recognize TJ and Willard Snyder. You all are out there. Those of us in military history certainly appreciate all the support the Snyders have given to the U.S. Commission on Military History, which is very active in the international arena. We've just come back from Bulgaria, which may strike people as a strange place to have a conference, but which we, in fact, had a very positive experience. Getting awards is fun. Doesn't happen all that often, and it's a good thing that we don't get too carried away. My cure for hubris is to go to Barnes & Noble, which I did this morning, and look for one of my books, which are never there. Sometimes, but not often. Today, nada. And then that's always, a helpful corrective when you begin to think of yourself as sort of indispensable to authorial activity. I've spent the last 20 years, it hardly seems possible, with work on the Korean War. 2 books are written, and one is half written, and as I tell people, of course, the rest of it is in my head. It better get on paper, though, pretty soon. I've already written 3 spin-off books from that experience. I have one more to do, and I'm now up and over the 20s in articles and essays like on Korea. I've had a lot of Korea, although not as much as the veterans who are here this evening. I want to tell you, though, without doubt, that this experience has turned me into a great expert on modern Asian history and strategy. I'm getting so damn old that MacArthur's the only guy I can mimic anymore. Okay. What I would like to do is talk about Harry Truman and the Korean War, to tell you at least what I think I've learned about the president, and in fact how my regard for him has, I think, come up slightly with that experience. Like most presidents, Harry S. Truman has had his ups and downs in popularity. He's fortunate to have had some very good biographers. And in fact, he's now beginning to get, I think, somewhat greater appreciation for his role in foreign and defense policy than might otherwise be the case, although his reputation in that area has always been pretty good. I doubt that Harry Truman knew where Korea was or thought much about it before June of 1950. From material at the Truman Library and other things I've read, it does not seem to have been a matter of great interest or concern for him. It might have been, and in fact I would argue that the critical event in bringing the Korean War about is the withdrawal of the 5th Regimental Combat Team from Korea in June of 1949, a withdrawal argued by the Pentagon to save money, one supported by the de facto chairman of the JCS, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and opposed by the State Department, which thought bringing this one last group of Americans back, about 5,000 troops, was a bad idea, as I think, in fact, it was. 5th Regimental Combat Team basically sat on the road from Tungduchan to Uijeongbu to Seoul, right exactly where they should have been, to block the direct route of invasion towards Seoul. The issues, however, that certainly grasped the president's imagination were many and complex, particularly the period between 1947 and 1950. You have the Straits Crisis, the Greek Civil War, the independence of Israel, the Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, NATO, in Asia, policy towards Japan, and the distress of the Chinese Civil War. If Korea was not high on the president's list of interests, it's not hard to understand. Whenever the president was quizzed by people about Korea, which he was very occasionally, he showed no particular knowledge or interest. Who had the Korea Watch? This was part of the problem. From 1945 to 1948, the War Department, which became the Department of the Army, was the supervisor of the occupation of Korea, which was attached to the occupation of Japan. Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, who was the SINC of U.S. Army forces in Korea, reported to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and to the Secretary of War, or Secretary of the Army. He was not, in fact, even under MacArthur's supervision, as MacArthur was SCAP, the occupation head in Japan, but not yet SINC Far East Command. In 1948, when Korea became an independent nation, it became the State Department's responsibility. And in fact, there was a military mission and an economic mission in Korea in 1948, and it was still there in 1950 when the invasion came. The United States, in fact, put a fair amount of money, $500 million of aid into Korea in the period 1945-1950, but it was done within the context of occupation policy. The State Department dealt with Korea largely as Korean issues affected the occupation of Japan and the potential negotiation of a peace treaty with Japan, which was, of course, done in 1951-1952. There was a problem, however, in Korea, which was that there was a war going on. In my own mind, I date it from April of 1948 right into June of 1950. I think I could almost accept dating it back to a general strike of 1947. Then there's a thing called the Autumn Harvest Revolt in the fall of 1946. There is fighting in Korea. In the War Memorial in Seoul are the name of about 7,500 members of the Korean security forces who died before June 25th, 1950. Some people put all Korean deaths as high as 100,000. I think that's a bit high. 30,000 I could buy. But concern and knowledge about affairs in Korea was at a fairly low level within both the Army and the State Department. For the president, I think, to say we've got a problem in Korea, which certainly would have been possible in 1948, I think it would have taken Dean Acheson and Douglas MacArthur's intervention to heighten his awareness, which did not happen. I think there was another problem, which is the Koreans had no domestic constituency within the United States, as the Jews had in their relationship to American policy towards Israel, or even the Chinese toward American policy in China. I think it's no secret that having domestic constituencies who are interested in the lands of their birth is a major factor sometimes in American foreign policy. Now, when the North Korean invasion came in June of 1950, the president, of course, was immediately involved, and deeply so, and became, in fact, a key decision maker in the period in which he remained in office until January of 1953. I think, in fact, he did pretty well as a good wartime leader. His challenge was that he felt it's necessary, as I believe it was, to improve America's general defense posture while at the same time waging a war. What I've applied is what I call the 1/3 formula, which is that about 1/3 of the money, the forces, equipment that the United States generated in 1950, 1953 went into fighting the Korean War, but 2/3 of it went into creating a strategic reserve and then sending forces to Europe. We had 7 American divisions in Korea. When the war ended, there were 6 American divisions in Germany. Now, many of you probably know about a memo, an internal study called NSC 68, which those of us who deal with the Cold War almost have to memorize or have tattooed on our hands or something because it's, you know, a point of great debate. It's often suggested that there were no military plans or force structure attached to NSC 68. That's flatly wrong. There were. And that force was generated by the war plans developed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a major conflict with the Soviet Union. The administration, which was trying to save money desperately, did not want really people to believe that we should be spending $40 billion a year on defense, as was recommended by the NSC 68 planners. And the force structure was known within the government, but not well publicized. By 1953, 1954, the structure of the American Armed Forces pretty much fit the force recommended by NSC 68, and in fact, the budget, for better or for worse, was in the $40 billion a year range. I think one can argue with justification that the Korean War provided an event which allowed the United States to do what it should have done to improve its military posture for long-term competition with the Soviet Union. Now, Truman was deeply involved in the decision to intervene in June and July of 1950. Sometimes forgotten that the original goal, which was accomplished, was to save the Republic of Korea. And in fact, there was general agreement within the executive branch that that was a worthy goal. And the Senate leadership and the House leadership, briefed on this in the early days of the war, agreed. Generating the ability to do this, of course, took several months of intense fighting and mobilization. The next question, which actually arose in July of 1950, was whether that goal to save the Republic of Korea was really enough. And the decision, which was finally made really in late September of 1950, was that for the ROK to remain safe, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that is the North Koreans, had to be pushed out of office, which led to the general conclusion that there would be then a unified Korea, which in fact was in a UN mandate established in 1947 and 1948. There was a great debate about the wisdom of going north and unifying Korea, but there was, as far as I can tell, within the executive branch, no serious dissent from that goal, which then became possible with the success of the Incheon landing and the Pusan breakout, September 15th and 17th. Now, the Chinese intervention, which then changed that war aim, remains a matter of rather considerable interest. Has a disagreement, maybe, maybe not. One of the things that's pretty clear, at least it was to me, and I've saw most of the 8th Army and Far East Command intelligence reports, is that everyone knew the Chinese were in large numbers in Manchuria. Their order of battle was known, their forces were certainly pretty closely developed in terms of numbers, force structure. The great unknown, however, was intentions. What would be the level of military assistance rendered by the Soviets? It was hard for the administration to think that Chinese intervention would not occur without Soviet support, and certainly they were correct. What is often overlooked is that Mao Zedong didn't know what the level of Soviet support would be. It was no wonder that the Americans had some trouble divining exactly what the Chinese were up to. And it was easy to find reasons, particularly in MacArthur's headquarters, to believe the Chinese were not quite the menace they turned out to be. Now, Truman could have stopped the movement north, certainly beyond the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. He did not, although he understood the issues. I'm not sure exactly how he would have been persuaded to veto a move north. I think it would have taken a combination of Dean Acheson, George C. Marshall, Averell Harriman, Frank Pace, and a lot of other people turning against the idea of unifying Korea, and they certainly did not do that. The JCS approved, somewhat reluctantly, but nevertheless approved the idea of going north, and Omar Bradley, whom the president trusted a great deal, also could find no reason not to go north. Now, after the Chinese intervention, the choices then become somewhat more limited: to expand the war, to fight on, to seek negotiations. And I think, frankly, the administration, led by the president, made the correct decision, which is to keep the war limited to Korea and to revert to the war aim of saving the Republic of Korea. The administration declared a state of emergency, went into a much more dramatic domestic mobilization, invigorated the European interest in NATO, which included rearming Germany, which was certainly a hot issue. It's often overlooked that, in fact, it's the last, I think it's the fourth supplemental of the defense budget for FY51, that it really is the rearmament budget, that the early parts of the budget that are adjusted are done as emergency measures to fight the war, but the real increase of American military power begins with the last part of FY51 budget and then continues in 52, 53, and 54. And it's the Chinese intervention that really creates that environment, not just the war as it began in June of 1950. The president also was instrumental in the administration's decision to seek some kind of negotiated settlement to the Korean War, which was certainly distasteful. Negotiating with the Chinese and the North Koreans was not anybody's cup of tea, but it was absolutely necessary. The administration probably exaggerated the degree of influence of the Soviet Union. Having been through much of the correspondence, and we have pretty good access to the Soviet-Chinese correspondence, it's clear that by 1951, it was Mao Zedong who wanted this war to go on. Joseph Stalin did too, but not quite as enthusiastically. When General MacArthur basically opposed the idea of negotiations, he then became a barrier to the administration's policy until MacArthur was removed in April of 1951. Basically, he was re-retired. He came back to the United States. I can remember as a high school student that we actually called off class so we could go watch the great man's speech to Congress. And I must tell you, it was a bravura experience. There's no question even now when you look at it that MacArthur's even better than Gregory Peck in giving that farewell speech, which he had memorized. And I read in one general's memoir somewhere, he said, the United States Army has never produced a single actor. And then he said, oh no, I forgot Douglas MacArthur. And this was written in the 1930s, I think pretty close. Harry Truman also had a great deal to do with the question of POWs and how they should be dealt with within the negotiations. My own view is that while the POW negotiations are important within the context of the Panmunjom negotiations, there are other factors that are, I think, more important in explaining why the war ended when it did. One is Joseph Stalin's death. The other is, in fact, the reform of the ROC Army and the status of the Chinese forces within North Korea. But the POW issue certainly was important. And the president intervened in the fall of 1951 to say that there would be no forcible repatriation, which was the American position. But it was not every American's position. In fact, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended some kind of arrangement in which all POWs would be exchanged as rapidly as possible. So all for all now was actually the sort of the government bureaucratic position, although state demurred from it. JCS concern, understandably, was the fate of U.S. POWs in enemy hands. I regret to say it was not the number of Koreans who had been captured or disappeared, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It was not even the number of UN, other nation troops. It was the Americans, estimated to be somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 POWs and or missing in action. Alive in captivity in the autumn of 1951, the numbers were somewhere around actually about 4,000 American servicemen. Communists, on the other hand, we held about 120,000 Koreans and Chinese. So if you're looking for all, we're pumping back 120,000 soldiers into their system. We're getting back 4,000 who probably are not going to fight much anymore since they weren't being well treated. I checked some statistics today. I always walk around with a book full of statistics. And it's kind of interesting because after March of 1951, there were about 2,600 American, well, let me back up. We had about around the 4,000 POWs in captivity. There were 2,600 POWs who died in captivity, probably more than that, but that's the numbers that we can count. Only 180 died after March of 1951. So in fact, the question of large-scale deaths of POWs, some degrees, had already been settled, and in part, I think the relatively good treatment of POWs, relatively good treatment, after the spring of 1951 is because the POWs had become an issue, and the Chinese and others realized that they would probably be returning these servicemen to friendly hands. Truman's position was that the United States was not going to send back POWs to certain death at communist hands, which was something we had done after World War II. U.S. military didn't like that policy. Allies didn't like the policy. Domestic critics didn't like the policy. I think it was essential, however, in winning the trust of the South Koreans, who were not altogether sure that the administration cared about them one way or the other. It certainly gave credibility to appeals to others who might fight communism in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. If they took our side in a cause, became involved in an insurgency, and then lost or got involved, would we, in fact, sell them out? Certainly a reasonable concern. I think in this case, the administration took the proper moral high ground. I think it was even more important because it finally showed the United States might actually care about Asian lives and even perhaps sacrifice some of our own. In summary, I think Truman gets pretty high marks as a Cold War president. Certainly compared to John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon, he looks like a wonder. The American president has a tough problem because he has to deal with what I would call a Hamiltonian emphasis upon power, national interests, realpolitik, and then the strain of Jeffersonianism, which I think we still feel, which is the belief in the universalism of liberty and democracy and the belief of kind of a Rousseauian natural man with release from the strains of oppressive government will do the right thing. Over time, I've become a little less committed to that idea, but I understand its power within American foreign policy. In summary, I think that that effort made by Harry Truman to balance Hamiltonianism and Jeffersonianism is part of his legacy, and one which I think in the long run we will always try to keep alive. Thank you, and I will be happy to take questions.